MSF provides healthcare to people affected by conflict, epidemics, disasters, or those excluded from healthcare. We do so irrespective of race, religion, creed, or political convictions. Our actions are guided by professional ethics and the principles of impartiality, independence, and neutrality. The settings that MSF work in are typically humanitarian settings. In other words, situations characterized by large-scale human suffering whose alleviation requires a systematic response. We do this in differing contexts: large refugee and internally displaced people camps, nomadic populations in rural areas, urbanized slum areas, detention centres, search and rescue boats in the Mediterranean, and in conflict-affected areas. Our teams are made up of tens of thousands of staff, health professionals, logistics, and administrative staff, most of them hired locally. We have over 8,000 nursing care providers in MSF working in over 70 countries. Nurses make up the largest cadre of our healthcare workforce. Of these nurses, over 95% are hired locally. Providing compassionate, comprehensive, safe nursing care in conflict is beset with numerous challenges: overwhelming needs, fragile security contexts, an unsafe physical environment. The weak coping capacity of the existing health systems are just a few of the day-to-day realities faced by our nursing teams. Although each context we work in is different, one recurring issue is that the nursing needs that confront us are often greater than the resources we have to meet those needs, making it impossible to deliver an ideal level of nursing care. It is our local nursing colleagues who carry most of this burden. During this video, our local nursing colleagues will share with you their personal experiences, their dedication to their communities and patients, their outstanding leadership skills, and how they uphold their professional nursing ethics. Nurses are accessible and enable access to healthcare. This is especially true for communities in remote areas and in conflict areas. Nursing staff are at the forefront of healthcare provision in MSF, and in conflict-affected areas, they are literally on the front line. Our nurses take steps to ensure their own and the safety of their loved ones, as well as that of their patients. For some of our nurses, their loved ones have fled to safety, and they have remained to serve their community.
Currently, my family and loved ones, we are staying together, but due to the ongoing conflict, some of my family members were displaced and have to leave the conflict zone to a nearby state of Yobe, that's Damaturu. But currently, my wife and my children, plus some of my loved ones, we are staying together here in Maiduguri.
Les personnes qui sont chères à moi et la famille, donc je suis avec mon épouse et mes enfants ici à Massissi, et aussi mes grands frères, donc la famille élargie se trouve à Goma. Ceux-là se trouvant à Goma, la famille qui se trouve à Goma, et ils sont là, ils n'ont pas fui l'insécurité, c'est là où ils érigent depuis des années.
I'm originally from Karen State in the south of the country, which is more than 500 kilometers away from here. All of my family has stayed there.
أنا أعيش مع أسرتي هنا، وأما أبي وأمي فهم يعيشون في الطرف الآخر من المدينة، فلكي أذهب إليهم ضروري من ركب سيارات رباعي طرق فرعية، كون الطرق الرئيسية مغلقة. فأنا مضطر على البقاء هنا كوني العائلة الرئيسي للعائلة.
MSF nurses are part of the communities they serve and have a good understanding of local issues and cultures which affect them, their families and loved ones, as well as their patients. Nurses spend considerable time with their patients, providing personal, intimate care and ensuring continuity of care over time. This proximity to patients and cultural sensitivity is invaluable for MSF.
The reason why I decided to stay here in this situation is because I see this community are suffering, and I know that there is lack of the nurses in this Bentiu state, So I decided to stay here to serve my community because I see that there is a need for me to stay here. So I really thinking if I left this area and more people are left, especially for the nurses, and who should help this community, and we should work here as a nurse.
أشتغل بالمجال هذا مجال التمريض لأنه عمل التمريض عمل إنساني بدرجة رئيسية. ثانياً من الناحية الاجتماعية فأنا أعمل لكي أحصل على أجر يعيننا على مواجهة الحياة والاستمرار بتقديم خدمات التمريض. فأنا باقي هنا بهذه مضطر البقاء والاستمرار بتقديم الخدمات التمريضية حتى يفرجها الله علينا.
I'm a nurse, and as a nurse, I'm supposed to give services to the community in need that have been uprooted from the houses by the conflict of the country.
Je suis décidé de travailler pas seulement à Massissi, qui soit les contextes d'insécurité. C'est vrai, nous avons des visions, mais d'abord nous sommes là à Massissi. Je suis là, et je travaille, je me donne. Je n'ai pas jusque-là l'envie de sortir, mais c'est parmi mes ambitions.
In conflict situations, the lack of security, the sheer scale of loss and destruction, and the chaotic, often frightening situations has a major impact on nurses. MSF nurses may have to provide nursing care within or close to active conflict zones, risking death not only whilst at work, but when commuting to and from work, sometimes having to cross a front line.
أبرز التحديات الفردية اللي يعاني منها الفريق التمريضي بمنظمة أطباء بلا حدود هي إمكانية وصولهم إلى مناطق عملهم. فمناطق عمل أطباء بلا حدود غالباً ما تكون بالخطوط الأمامية القريبة من الناس المتضررين من النزاعات. فهذه المناطق دائماً تكون بعيدة عن مناطق سكن الموظفين، وكذلك طرق الوصول إليها دائماً ما تكون صعبة. فيكون أبرز التحديات هو وصول الموظفين بأمان إلى مناطق عملهم، وكذلك عودتهم من مناطق عملهم إلى منازلهم بأمان. هذا بحد ذاته يعتبر تحدي. المنظمة دائما تعمل على إيصال موظفيها إلى أماكن عملهم وبالعكس بصورة آمنة.
Curfews and roadblocks are common in conflict-affected areas. Curfews make it very difficult to provide 24-hour nursing care.
Initially, when the curfew was declared, it has really affected the nursing job. For example, a shift that you're supposed to come for the night shift to come at 6 p.m., you have to reduce the time to come around 5 p.m. And this have a lot of stress for the night team and nursing activities as well. And some of the patient caretakers do complain that they cannot come to hospital during the curfew hours. So in that regard, it has also affected the nursing activities because a patient that's supposed to come less critical have to stay more hours at home before they arrive to hospital, which wasn't the situation.
La manière dont ce couvre-feu touche ou impacte sur mon travail, c'est que d'abord c'est une situation vraiment étrange qui nous arrive, qui nous demande de quitter des fois le boulot urgemment, alors qu'on devait encore dispenser les soins, on devait dispenser encore d'énergie aux côtés des malades, mais le couvre-feu s'impose. Et ça impacte beaucoup plus sur le patient parce que la journée, quand nous sommes nombreux, mais la nuit, c'est une équipe qui reste réduite. Et là, les amis qui restent s'efforcent de mieux travailler malgré leur nombre réduit. À moi, aussi quand je rentre vite, je ne suis pas à l'aise. Je ne me sens pas tellement à l'aise parce que je laisse encore certaines choses à faire, quelques activités à faire.
Sometimes when there is a curfew, it is really difficult, especially when there is roadblocks in POC between the UNIMIS compound and IDP camps.
Conflict brings high patient numbers, and nurses cannot devote as much time as normal to individual patients and have to work longer hours despite physical and emotional fatigue. Finding well-trained nursing staff becomes a constant struggle in conflict settings. In Syria, since the beginning of the conflict in 2011, hundreds of health professionals have been killed, imprisoned, tortured, or they have emigrated. For nursing leaders, staffing shortages is a common problem they need to mitigate. The use of non-qualified or student nurses is a common compromise, but this also brings a higher supervision burden.
In case I have staff shortages, we do contact our administrator to see if we can have a daily worker in our pool to call to work for that day. Sometimes the supervisor has to work as a nurse to cover this gap for the shift.
As in our project has high turnover rate, we are facing nurse shortage very often. At the time, we have to allocate tasks and responsibility within our team until we hire new members.
Avoir des infirmiers diplômés d'État, c'était une perle rare. Moi, comme superviseur de la pédiatrie, j'avais comme coéquipier du personnel ayant reçu une formation de sécurisme de base. Pour certains, 6 mois, pour d'autres, 9 mois. Ce staff assurait la garde dans les services sensibles comme les soins intensifs. Il fallait renforcer leurs compétences à travers des formations hebdomadaires. Mais poursuivre cette formation au chevet des patients, c'était ça qui était vraiment très très important. Donc les accompagner au chevet des patients, leur montrer des petites techniques pour qu'ils puissent développer leurs compétences. Mais ce n'était pas facile.
In conflict settings, nurses are required to take on additional roles. This may result in nurses working beyond the scope of their training or experience. For example, treating wounds and injuries that they have not encountered before, diseases they have studied only in theory, dealing with mass casualties or assisting the diagnostics lab. There may be no referral possibilities, requiring teams to deal with everything they see.
يضطر ممرضو أطباء بلا حدود لسد الثغرات اللي ممكن تحصل بالفرق الأخرى. الفرق الأخرى خارج نطاق التمريض وخارج خارج المنطقة الطبية، ممكن تعمل كمرشد اجتماعي، ممكن تعمل كموظف إداري. هذا بصورة مؤقتة حتى تسد مجموعة من الثغرات اللي تحصل بسبب نقص بأعضاء الفرق الأخرى أو بسبب نقص بأعضاء الفريق نفسه.
Conflit de la communauté impacte sur notre travail. En réalité, ils augmentent les tâches. Alors, nous nous adaptons. Nous nous adaptons. Dès qu'il y a l'accalmie dans la communauté, dès qu'il y a l'accalmie au lieu de front, ce sont peut-être aussi les épidémies qui peuvent prendre place. Mais si ce n'est pas des épidémies et aussi le phénomène de conflit, l'hôpital à un certain moment est dégagé et nous sommes là aussi, nous respirons un peu.
In conflict settings, nursing care is provided in damaged and potentially unsafe facilities, makeshift camps, or temporary tented setups. These environments do not allow for optimal IPC standards, despite the best efforts of IPC nurses. Field hospitals without proper ventilation systems and copious dust hinders a nurse's ability to maintain a simple aseptic field for wound care and IV cannula insertion. Lack of space reduces the ability for the isolation of patients when needed. Lack of or narrow spaces do not allow for privacy, impacting greatly upon the provision of personal care and the delivery of end-of-life care.
Bambari, en ce temps, les enfants à la pédiatrie étaient mis 2 par 2 sur le lit. Vous imaginez tous les risques en termes de prévention et contrôle des infections. Il arrivait parfois à Bambari où, en 2017-2018, où s'il y avait l'afflux des blessés, l'équipe ne pouvait pas quitter l'hôpital et on était obligé de passer la nuit à l'hôpital. Vraiment, ce n'était pas vraiment facile.
When supply lines are cut, nurses must work with fewer resources, requiring rapid, on-the-spot assessment and problem solving, including making judgments about what compromises can be made to nursing care with minimal impact on patient safety and well-being. For example, in Gaza, disinfection materials such as chlorine, needed for sterilisation and the reprocessing of health equipment and for the adequate decontamination of water, is subject to heavy restrictions by the Israeli government from entering the country. And in Yemen, a recent aerial attack on an MSF hospital hit the supply warehouse where IPC consumables were stored, hindering the ability of nurses to protect themselves and their patients.
Some of the medications and equipment that we are using, we may came out of rupture of them due to breakage in supply chain, as mentioned. But we try our best to innovate and improvise to use some of the local items, local medication here that is being produced in the country to complement. For example, during the mass casualty plan, for a patient that is recovering, that we need a stretcher, that we need crutches, we improvised and used local materials here to make crutches.
In some conflict contexts, even the basics of clean water is not available due to contamination of the water supply systems. For nurses, this impacts upon the flushing of nasogastric tubes, hand hygiene, assisting patients with their personal hygiene and activities of daily living. And then there are the wider processes nurses are responsible for, such as the cleaning and disinfection of nursing equipment, the hospital kitchen, and the feeding of their patients, laundry services, and the providing of clean sheets. In conflict settings, the shortage of electricity is frequent, and alternatives such as generators or solar panels might not be available or were perhaps destroyed. Electricity is needed for the running of oxygen concentrators, suction pumps, lighting, and sterilisation equipment, to name a few. For MSF nurses, technical and ethical dilemmas are a constant feature of working in conflict settings. Nurses' knowledge and practices must adapt to the shifting ecology of war. It is crucial for nurses to train and build their capacities. For example, learning how to make the needed adaptations for IPC. The treatment of rape and sexual violence may be new for them. Learning to triage a large influx of patients in a mass casualty. For wound care, the nature of war injuries and the weapons used in recent warfare cause massive tissue destruction, increasing the likelihood of infection, and multi-drug-resistant organisms are frequently found in these wounds. Nurses need to learn how to deal with these wounds and injuries.
بداية النزاع كانت تواجهنا صعوبة في التعامل مع الحالات الحرجة، كوننا أول مرة نواجه مثل الحالات، فكان هناك تدريب مستمر للطاقم للتعامل مثل هذه الإصابات، مثل التعامل مع الإصابات الجماعية وإصابات الأطفال والحوامل وصغار السن، فأصبح الطاقم اليوم قادر على مواجهة أي حالة مثل هذه الحالات.
La formation que nous avons réussi et que nous continuons à recevoir nous rappelle toujours, nous intègre toujours comment devons nous sécuriser et aussi comment devons sécuriser les malades.
90% من التدريبات اللي ناخذها تكون متوافقة مع المرضى اللي نشوفهم بصورة دورية. تبقى 10% من الحالات اللي نشوفها هي حالات نادرة، نضطر هنا نحولها إلى باقي أقسام منظمة أطباء بلا حدود، الأقسام الأخرى كالفريق الطبي، كالفريق الدعم النفسي، كفريق رعاية الأم والطفل، نسائية وتوليد. التمريض منذ بداية الصراع إلى الآن ماشي بتطوير، وذلك من خلال عدد الندوات والدورات اللي حضروها الفريق التمريضي، اللي كانت دائما تسعى إلى تقديم أفضل عناية ممكنة بالمرضى وأفضل عناية تمريضية ممكن نوصل لها.
One challenge in humanitarian settings is that nurses may have to care for their own family members, friends, or acquaintances. And in conflict settings, nurses may even be called upon to nurse perpetrators of violence or members of hostile forces. Our nurses uphold their nursing ethics and embody the principles of impartiality, independence, and neutrality.
I really see also it is very difficult, but for me as a nurse and as a person who is working for MSF for so long, yeah, it is something that I always keep in mind that I should keep neutrality.
احنا كمنظمة أطباء بلا حدود واحدة من أبرز رسائل عملنا هي معالجة المرضى بغض النظر عن الجنس والعمر واللون والعرق والشكل. احنا الهدف من وجودنا هو رعاية طبية ورعاية تمريضية للكل بدون استثناء بدون تمييز.
J'avais déjà dit plus haut que l'hôpital est toujours considéré comme une zone neutre. Mais dans le cas de conflits, les belligérants ne comprennent pas bien ce concept. Alors pour maintenir la neutralité et l'impartialité, les RECO, les relais communautaires, faisaient un travail en amont dans la communauté. Cela est complété par des affiches dans les hôpitaux et les gardiens également aidaient pour maintenir de l'ordre au sein de l'hôpital. Et nous, en tant que soignants, on continuait toujours ce slogan de MSF. Avec MSF, c'est la neutralité, c'est l'impartialité.
In my nursing medical ethic, actually, where I get my training, it is always good to remain neutral, and this will serve your life. And this will also give more trust on you, on any services that you deliver. Because in a situation where you have a conflict like South Sudan, if you take side by supporting other side, actually, even what you give as a nurse will not be recognized by the other party. So you don't want to put yourself in between. Let the party decide what they want to do, but as a nurse, you receive only the patient. My future, my impression is only to deal with patient only, I'm not interested on politics, I'm not interested on military appellation, nothing. I actually remain neutral for life. And my neutrality and impartiality, that's why I stay still alive in South Sudan, so that I don't want to bother myself in politics. And this is why I'm able also today to talk to you. Yeah.
My message to the entire nurses of the world is, number one, I would say kudos to them all. As WHO declared the 2020 the year of nurses, and it happens during that time we have intense upsurge in COVID-19, which nurses team played a very vital role. I want to say kudos to all the nurses around the world, plus my nurses here in the humanitarian axis, working here in the conflict zone. And then to the nurses that lost their life during this pandemic, may their soul rest in peace. And then I will encourage my nurses all over the world to steadfast, and then so that we render more care being expected by us, from us, by the community.